Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us today. You know, I recently had the opportunity to attend a industry breakfast sponsored by a state agribusiness association. And the presentation at this event was from a state road commission representative, a road association, if you will. And the purpose of the talk was really talking about the challenges that are being experienced at the state and the federal level around sustainable transportation funding, and basically building and maintaining roads, bridges, tunnels, etc. And obviously, it's very relevant to agribusiness because so much of the products that we handle and the value-added products that we produce, of course, are transported over the roadways, the bridges, et cetera, across the United States. It's really the arteries of the economy. And so it was a very interesting conversation. But as I'm sitting there, it really started to dawn on me, you know, the problems that they were talking about. And how do you ensure that you maintain sustainable funding for our transportation needs over the long term? It reminded me the fact that across agribusiness, across the worlds and industries in which we operate, we need to be reminded that the metrics that we use, the indicators of success that we monitor, the ways that we assess if we're making progress, if we're maintaining performance, they evolve over time. And they're always really, really complex at the beginning. They then tend to become familiar. They tend to normalize over time. And then eventually they atrophy. And we need to revisit them. And it's a lesson that is learned many times again and again and again. But this discussion and this topic, which was so relevant to agribusiness, really brought it into focus for me. And I thought it would be good for us to spend a few minutes today talking about this. And specifically what I want to talk about is the underlying impermanence of metrics and the fact that we need to remember at all times that what we're measuring today, one, it has to reflect what the outcome is we're trying to produce, but two, we need to reflect or understand that it may not always be the right metric. We need to talk about the seductive promises of simplistic solutions. So when one metric isn't working and the next obvious one presents itself, how easy it is to just chase that and really miss an opportunity to think deeper and broader and more richly about the right metrics. And three, I want to talk a little bit about the risks of metric myopia and misfire. Because again, in these moments where a metric is no longer working, it really creates an opportunity to move the business forward, to move the discussion forward, to deepen and enrich understanding. And if we get too myopic, if we're too narrow in our thinking, too calcified in what we consider as valid inputs, we again really miss that opportunity. And so today I want to talk about metrics that matter. And so to do that, we're going to do it through the story of the challenges in transportation funding. And so to talk about the impermanence of metrics, in the United States, for decades and decades, we have had basically a consumption-based tax system or tax scheme for funding transportation, roads, bridges, et cetera. And it's all been in the form of the fuel tax. So we all know how the fuel tax works, but let's just review it for a moment. There is a tax levied on every gallon of liquid fuel that is purchased to be put into a vehicle. So whether it's diesel, it's low octane, high octane, ethanol blend, whatever it might be, there's a tax that's added to every gallon that's purchased. And that tax is added at the point of sale. So having it added at the point of sale does a couple of things. One, the underlying tax is remarkably easy to calculate, because it's just derived from the number of gallons that are purchased. And all of these fuel pumps are metered and monitored by state regulatory agencies, right? You see a little sticker that says it's been certified and inspected. And they found a way to actually blend that tax in right with that point of sale, so it reduces friction for the consumer, right? It's just baked into the price of that gallon of diesel or that gallon of petrol. And I mean, think about it, right? You drive down the road, you look at a couple different gas stations, you get a sense what the market price is. You either wait until you actually have to stop and fill up, or you go to your favorite gas station and that's where you buy your gas. And so this has worked for a very, very long time because, again, it was very simple to administer and monitor based on consumption. And it was very easy to actually collect, blended right in with the purchase. The challenge is that it's no longer working, which was really the impetus for the presentation that inspired today's topic. It should be no news to most of you, if not all of you, that transportation funding is woefully inadequate relative to the needs that we have in the country. Our state and federal fuel tax schemes do not produce enough revenue to cover the construction of new and maintenance of existing transportation infrastructure in the country. And the presentation talked about a number of different reasons for this. I think in no particular order, one of them was that simply the costs to build new roads, the cost to maintain bridges, the costs to augment, to enhance, to enlarge the different transportation arteries, both in city and rural environments, has gone up considerably over time. The raw materials, the input costs have gone up. Labor costs have gone up. The equipment that is used to move the dirt, to shape the earth to suit what we're trying to do, that has all gone up. I would suspect that likely the environmental permitting and environmental review processes that accompany a lot of these projects have also gone up, right? So the regulatory burden, legitimate or not, this is not a political statement, just those actual costs have gone up relative to the underlying projects that we're doing. So that's one problem. Along with that, we don't generally raise our fuel tax very often. It's a very political, it's a very painful, it's sort of the third rail in many cases of taxes that we do not want to raise because people buy gas so frequently that when the taxes go up, it's felt. And again, a real power of this is that the taxes are hidden. And if you don't raise the taxes, you can kind of stay away from that. The underlying fuel tax is often, I believe, or perhaps never indexed to inflation. So as all these costs are going up to maintain the roads, the tax that's collected that is meant to fund those costs that are increasing itself doesn't change. So you actually have this structural problem where over time the gap becomes wider, deeper, and more painful. And now where the presentation spent a lot of time talking about, though, was actual fuel efficiency. And we are on a secular trend towards more fuel-efficient vehicles, not just domestically, but around the world. And you could talk a lot about EVs or hybrids, but just if you look over the last 15, 20 years, the sheer gains in fuel efficiency that the consumers have realized and businesses have realized has been dramatic. Miles per gallon is one of the marketing features of vehicles when promoting and trying to get them in front of consumers when they're considering a purchase or a lease. And so while that fuel efficiency, that broadly shared trend towards more fuel-efficient vehicles is great from an environmental standpoint and is great on the individual level from a taxation and cost standpoint, it actually works to amplify or magnify the structural underlying issues in our consumption-based tax scheme. And so we're now at a point where these compounding factors, the costs associated with maintaining and building roads, the fact that we don't routinely adjust the fuel tax, the fact that it doesn't have any triggers to automatically tick up or tick down relative to inflation, and the fact that we're actually using more fuel-efficient vehicles, which then are using the same amount of fuel but getting more miles and more use, just continues to widen this gap. And this is an example of the impermanence of metrics.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
I don't know that 30 years ago, I can't say for sure, but 30 years ago, I don't recall hearing a lot of discussions about severe deficits in state coffers for transportation needs. But it's something you hear a lot about now. And that's a good lesson for us in our businesses. We need to think about the metrics that we've used over time, the legacy metrics that are comfortable, that are familiar, where we have the inertia and the benefit of being able to look back over many years to see how we've been doing over time. You know, that longitudinal look at metrics is really attractive. It's really hard to let go of. But you need to look beyond that and say, okay, as rich as this is, because we have 10 years of data telling us how we're performing today relative to multiple different timeframes in the past. And despite the fact that we have all the mechanisms in place to collect this data, to collect the information, to feel confident of the quality of the information, is producing a valid metric, a valid output, a number we can believe in and defend, that's all great. But if the information it gives you that you're so confident in defending actually is not reflective of what you're trying to do in your business, you are now running up against the impermanence of metrics and you need to make a change. And so that's where we're at with transportation funding. And so the discussion shifted very quickly towards the proposal. So what do we do about chronic, endemic gaps and deficiencies in transportation funding? And the presentation, the discussion was towards a mileage/use-based model, whereby we are looking to decouple the taxation from consumption. So how many gallons you buy no longer has any connection to the fuel tax you pay, but it's rather the use of the vehicle. How many miles does that vehicle put on the roads? That would now be the denominator against which a tax would be applied. And now we didn't have clarity on what that looks like, right? Is that a flat fee per vehicle? Is that a meter that's installed in your car and periodically it's downloaded, right? You go to a government center and they plug it in and they extract how many miles you drove, and then that becomes a bill. Is it a real-time monitor, which I'm guessing many of us would feel very uncomfortable about having a government-implemented real-time monitor on our vehicles, though it's arguably not very different than our cell phones, but nonetheless, having this constant real-time data feed. And there's a lot of questions about, just one, how would it work? How would it be collected? How would it be assessed, et cetera? And what I think was interesting was how quickly this got momentum, because it felt like a comfortable, despite the challenges of implementing it, a comfortable incremental change in the right direction, and really centered around this idea that it would rectify this really unfair advantage that high fuel efficient or hybrid or electric vehicles have. There was a lot of discussion about how EVs, which are out on the road all the time, contribute nothing to the building and maintenance of the roads upon which they drive, which is true. If you have an electric vehicle, beyond your licensing fees, you're not paying anything into the system. If you have a hybrid, you're paying much less than a conventional combustion-based engine counterpart is doing. If you have a high fuel-efficient combustion model, you're getting an advantage. Perhaps not as great as a hybrid, certainly not as good as an EV, but you're using those roads and you're not paying an amount that's equal to others. And so there was a lot of attention on this, which I thought was really interesting. And we'll get back to this in a minute and why I think that's a problem. But it just, I guess my point overall is that it was really just a quick momentum towards mileage is straightforward. We can figure out how much people drive. It will catch these sort of unfair players that don't participate in the current funding, and it'll fix our model. Now, the reason I say the seductive simplicity of these solutions is one, of course, how are you going to implement it? How are you going to do it? All those things I talked about. But it also fails to consider how people would react. If suddenly every mile you drove was something you had to pay tax on, we've already seen how consumers change behaviors. As gas prices go up, so too does the demand for more fuel-efficient vehicles. Sometimes for smaller vehicles, for hybrids, for EVs, et cetera. If all of a sudden you think about, well, that 30-mile drive to town is going to cost me XYZ in terms of tax, well, I'm guessing people will get a little bit more diligent about combining the different errands they do in town into fewer trips. Perhaps combining trips with other families or households. Perhaps looking for alternate ways to reduce the amount of mileage they're driving as an offset. And so in many ways you could, and I don't have an empirical study to defend this, but just conceptually, you could end up replicating the same deficiencies we have today with a new metric scheme if it was just a simple move to mileage. And that's the problem with simple solutions and incomplete thinking. So I don't think that a mileage or use-based model in this context is wrong, but it's likely incomplete. And why do I say that? So that takes us to the third part here. and the risks of metric myopia and misfire. This is a perfect opportunity. As you're thinking about, as you've identified the problem, as you've thought about a preliminary solution, now you need to go back to, okay, what is the actual underlying problem that we're trying to solve? What is the thing in our business we're trying to measure? What tells us if performance is either at the level we expect and want or going in that direction? And in this case, what we're actually talking about is how do we create a sustainable funding source for transportation needs in this country? And when you think about that, it becomes very obvious that, taxing based on fuel consumption is imperfect. It doesn't work. We know it's not working, at least not the way it's currently set up. But moving to mileage, that's incomplete too. If you think about the actual what is causing the underlying need, what causes the need for transportation investment? What causes a road to need to be repaved every X number of years? For culverts to be repaired and replaced? For bridges to be inspected, repaved, resurfaced, perhaps reinforced? It's the impact of the use. It's the miles driven times some type of weight or performance factor that gives you an actual view on what is the impact. Impact is what we should be measuring. Because if you know the impact of a vehicle on a per mile basis, now you have a clear direct line of sight between what sort of transportation investment does that vehicle based on its characteristics, for example, weight, etc., and its use, what kind of impact does that create, which then translates to the investment needs that are required to sustain it. And maybe to make this simple, I think about this in the terms of, we all check into hotels when we're traveling for work with our families, and they often will give you the security deposit or tell you security deposit's going to be a hold to be put on your credit card, right? And if you gently and mildly use that hotel room, meaning you're not a rock star on tour, and you're not throwing TVs out the windows or setting the bed on fire or flooding the room, you're going to get your deposit back, right? You rent an apartment, you pay a security deposit, and maybe beyond a few minor dings here and there, you're going to get most of the deposit back, unless your behavior, unless your impact is greater than others, in which case that deposit then would be kept, right? You're paying for the impact. You're not paying for the use. The use is there based within the rent or within the hotel fees. And so in this context, again, I would really encourage us to be thinking deeper about our metrics in our business. Recognize that metrics are impermanent. Work hard to not fall victim to that seductive simplicity of new solutions. And really make sure that as you think about the changes that you're going to make, the necessary changes that are going to be made, that they are complete, that they're accurate, that they're anchored and tied into the actual problem you're trying to solve, and that they're not going to, in a very short period of time, replicate the challenges that you've already seen, that they're not going to replicate the deficiencies or the lack of clarity or the obfuscation between what you're trying to measure and the actual performance and outcomes that you want. So I hope that's been helpful today. A little bit of a different twist. It's not directly an agribusiness topic, but again, it's something that we all use. And I think it's a very good example of both the complexity and the challenge, but the real opportunity of thinking about metrics in a different and more enriched way to get a better view on the current and future performance of our businesses and organizations. So thank you as always for tuning in. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod on your device on the platform of choice right now. You can do it right now. If you want to support the show, please consider leaving us a review. It's the best way for us to get the word out about this show, helps us improve the quality of the content, and make sure that the people who need it the most are most likely to get access to it. And to continue the conversation, you can always connect with me, Joe Mosier, on LinkedIn, or you can set up a call directly by visiting Mosier Consulting Group online at mosiercg.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.